This is BBC One. Now we present live coverage of His Majesty the King's visit to the Palace of Westminster.
Westminster Hall, a place with nearly 1,000 years of history and the oldest part of the Palace of Westminster. This morning, it will be the place to which the new king will come for a ceremony that illustrates the relationship between royalty and Parliament, and indeed our system of constitutional monarchy. It was at Balmoral last Thursday that the Queen's passing meant the end of one reign and the beginning of another. And as tributes continue to be paid to Her Majesty here and around the world, today it is her son, the new king, who will hear them in person from parliamentarians. It's only 2 days since His Majesty was formally proclaimed king at St James's Palace. And now we are about to see him come to the Palace of Westminster for the first time as our sovereign and our new head of state. For members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords have already gathered inside Westminster Hall. The ceremony will begin shortly, but it is not often that the two houses come together in this historic setting, a setting which goes right back to the days of William the Conqueror's son, who built it. And the occasion for which they're gathered this morning is in itself historic, but also poignant. There will be motions of condolence to the King, and he is expected to arrive here shortly to receive them. Good morning and welcome to our live coverage. We will take you back into Westminster Hall in just a few moments as events there get underway. If you want to continue watching that live stream, it is available to you via the red button. But with me now in the studio are two people who know the new king, Paddy Harverson, who worked with him for nearly 10 years as his communications secretary, and Giles Brandreth, writer, broadcaster, former MP, and someone who was close to the late Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen. Giles, tell us first about the significance of this morning's ceremony.
Well, Westminster Hall is an extraordinary building. It is, as you say, the oldest part of Parliament, built by William Rufus, son of William I, William the Conqueror, improved by Richard II. It was the place where royal coronation feasts used to take place. But the relationship between royalty and Parliament has been a fraught one over the years. It's where King Charles I was tried. So it has mixed emotions for if you're the sovereign. Right outside it is a statue of Oliver Cromwell. It was the place where the courts were. The King's Bench, the senior courts were all there. And it's also, of course, in recent years, the place where there have been lyings in state. Last time I was there was for the lying in state of the Queen Mother. But parliamentarians come together there to be addressed by international figures, Nelson Mandela, Barack Obama, the Pope.
And the stage is set. They are awaiting the beginning of the formal beginning of the ceremony when the King arrives there. Paddy Harverson, you know him well. You worked for him for a long time. How will he be approaching this moment, this particular moment?
I think, he'll be as prepared as possibly he can be. He said it in his address, he will follow the example of his mother, the late Queen, and so he really understands the importance. This moment sort of cements the relationship in our constitution between government and the head of state. So he'll address the occasion with great sincerity, of course, and a sense of duty.
He's had long years to prepare for it, but in a way perhaps nothing can prepare you for the actual moment of taking over from your mother.
No, not at all. I mean, 15 years ago when I was there, we were working on the planning for just these moments. For him, of course, it meant really, which he wouldn't really want to dwell upon, the death of his mother. So he just wanted to make sure that we were prepared and the palace was prepared. And when the moment came, I feel, and we've seen this the last few days, he very much rises to the occasion, and it's very deeply personal for him. So his address was his and his alone, and it very much was in his character.
And Giles, everywhere you look in this hall, the surroundings and also the beginnings of the ceremony, just the history and those links between royalty and Parliament are everywhere.
It's 1,000 years of history. It's quite extraordinary. The kings who celebrated their coronations here, the trial of Charles I, the lying in state of former sovereigns. This is living history. And what's fascinating, I think, about these recent days is this combination of private grief for us as individuals, particularly for the royal family, and seeing the machinery of state working effortlessly. We're seeing here tradition and the value of tradition, making this 1,000-year ritual just continue seamlessly, and it makes, government work better as a consequence.
Private grief, and yet, Paddy, unlike his siblings, the new king, in the midst of his grief, it is public duties like this which are going to take place throughout this whole week and take him to all 4 nations of the UK.
Yes, I mean, I wonder if, I think he'd probably take comfort in that. I mean, because I wouldn't say it was a distraction, but it obviously means he's got a very clear role that he's had to fulfill, immediately the affairs of state, as head of state. So he's taken on with his new queen by his side with great vigour, a great character. We've seen a little bit of the informal tone as well, his meeting people outside the palace, his own personality starting to come through as our new king. But, I've been in awe and actually so proud to see him.
But no surprise to you then, the tone that he has struck?
No, not at all. I mean, I worked with him for 10 years and he's the hardest working person I've ever known. He has great passion for his country, great passion for the issues, that he takes such an interest in, and also great sense of humour. And I think we've seen that already. I noticed in that meeting with sort of Commonwealth, leaders that he was already laughing and showing I think he's really come to the fore, his own personality in this moment.
And indeed, Giles, amid being surrounded by the weight of history, also the human side.
Totally. I mean, he is a workaholic, but he's recognised that he's going to actually change his life totally. And now this is going to be what his new role is. And I think he's come to it at the right age. He feels like, as it were, the grandfather of the nation.
Giles, Paddy, thank you for now. Well, this ceremony in this very special part of the Palace of Westminster, Petroc Trelawney is inside Westminster Hall now.
Mishal, thank you. For 900 years, this hall has been at the heart of our nation's history. Within these walls, wars have been declared and coronations celebrated. Foreign presidents have addressed this country, and kings, queens and prime ministers have lain in state. Today, it's where Charles III will make his first visit to the Palace of Westminster as monarch. He'll be addressed by speakers of both houses. Coming into the hall now, the Lord Speaker, the Lord McFall of Alcuith. From Dumbarton in Scotland, a former headmaster who became a Labour MP and then a minister. Lord Speaker of the House of Lords since 2019. There are 1,200 people gathered here today, members of both Houses of Parliament, parliamentary staff and their guests, and there is a very palpable sense of anticipation and excitement in the air as MPs and peers prepare to hear the man that until now they've known as Prince and heir to the throne speak in Westminster for the first time as King. Black Rod standing behind the Lord Speaker. Sarah Clark, the first woman to be Black Rod in the 650-year history of the role. The two empty thrones where the King and the Queen Consort will sit. The Lords To their right, the Commons to their left. The white swan's feathers that are such a key part of the distinctive headdress of the gentleman at arms. A bodyguard instituted by Henry VIII in 1509. And now the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, Member of Parliament for Chorley in Lancashire. And in front of him carrying the mace, Ubana Uyet, the first black sergeant of arms in the post-600-year history. Well, when the King and Her Majesty the Queen Consort arrive in 10 minutes or so, they'll be greeted by the Lord Great Chamberlain, a role key to royal ceremonial. A new monarch means a new holder of that position, the 7th Baron Carrington, on duty for the first time today. As the King arrives, we'll hear a fanfare from the state trumpeters, and then the Union flag flying at half-mast on Victoria Tower will be lowered and the royal standard raised in its place to indicate to the city outside that the King is here. There have only been several days of tributes from MPs and Lords, some solemn, others provoking laughter. This morning, the sentiments of our politicians will be distilled into 2 short addresses of condolence delivered by the 2 speakers. Then His Majesty the King will respond. There is Lord Rupert Carrington, the new Lord Great Chamberlain, walking down the centre of Westminster Hall. This great open space, this extraordinary roof ensuring that there are open views from all sides, no pillars to block any vista within. They make their way to the north door, ready to greet the King when he arrives in a few minutes' time.
So inside Westminster Hall they're ready, and we can show you now Clarence House, the overhead shot of Clarence House, because that is where the King still is for the moment. He will be leaving very shortly, but Clarence House is still his home, just around the corner from Buckingham Palace. It is where he and the Queen Consort are still in residence. It is their London home, and in the next few moments we're expecting to see them depart from there and make the very short journey towards the Houses of Parliament and to enter Westminster Hall to see that gathering there, assembled there for them, and to then hear the tributes and the condolences and respond to them. And Giles, it's remarkable really that this moment in time, the accession of a new monarch, came within the same week of a new Prime Minister, which is such a contrast to what the Queen had when she acceded to
Yes, when the Queen came to the throne back in 1952, the Prime Minister was Sir Winston Churchill, who had known her when she was a little girl, who in the 1920s had actually sat her on his knee. And he had been the Prime Minister for her father, King George VI, during the Second World War. He was the grand old man of British politics. But nonetheless, they had their weekly meeting, their audience. When he was asked what they talked about, he said racing mostly. But in fact, every Prime Minister has spoken of the value of their weekly audience with the Sovereign, an opportunity to talk to somebody when you know it's not going to be leaked. You can unburden yourself to them, and the Queen, by all accounts, listened with good humour, wisdom, and indeed had the right to be consulted, and she was, and I think to warn, to advise. She will have done all that above party politics, and it's absolutely clear that the new king has absorbed that message. He is not going to be interfering in politics, but he is going to be a sounding board for prime ministers. And this new one, this very young one, born 102 years after Winston Churchill was born, Liz Truss, only came into the office last week.
Well, we can now see that they are on their way. His Majesty the King, Her Majesty the Queen Consort. They're in their car, on their way down the Mall and heading towards the Palace of Westminster. Paddy, it will be a different role, and he's had a long time to think about the different role. As Prince of Wales, he had a freedom to express himself that won't now be open to him.
Yes, and he said very clearly, and I thought it was extremely noticeable in his address, that he will follow the example of his mother. He understands the constitutional conventions that come with being head of state, so I think he'll do it beautifully and brilliantly. He'll bring his own personality to it. You know, I think for some of the issues that he cares deeply about, most importantly the environment, he'll still care about, he'll still think about, and, you know, as Giles said, in private meetings with the Prime Minister, will share his views as he's entitled. But yes, it's a very different role, and he completely understands that.
It won't be a difficult adjustment for him?
No, not at all. He's a very wise man. He's watched his mother do it brilliantly, and he's very much dedicated to doing the same. So no, he'll adapt instantly.
And this journey that he's making now, Giles, it's a journey he's made many times. He stood in for his mother at the State Opening Parliament. He's been at her side. But this is a very resonant journey, isn't it? It's a moment of national significance, but also for him personally. You wonder what's going through his mind as he travels to Parliament, to the home of our democracy for the first time as sovereign.
This is it. This is the real thing. And somebody said to me outside Buckingham Palace yesterday, just somebody I happened to meet, he said, it's every inch a king. He really seems to be fulfilling it. And I think he has just accepted his destiny. People said back in 1952 that the extraordinary thing about the Queen was, though she was only 25 years of age, she seemed to accept what was happening to her. And he has clearly accepted this. And the fact that this is a system that has been running for so many hundreds of years, and the constitutional monarchy for now nearly a century, means that it is quite easy to do, to step into the role. There is a role to be fulfilled, and he is ready to fulfill it.
Did you discuss in your time with him, Paddy, how he planned to fulfil his role?
Not directly, no. I got hints down the years that he would, you know, obviously bring his own character to it. But he always said, and he said privately and publicly, I know it's a different job and I will do it differently.
Well, there they are, going down Whitehall now, the outriders in front of them, and beside them they're passing the government departments, the place where government business is conducted every day, and they're approaching Parliament Square now, and then we'll see them in a moment go through the gates into the Palace of Westminster itself. And of course then the door of Westminster Hall is right there before them, so there are some crowds lining their path. And let's rejoin Petrol Trelawney now inside Westminster Hall.
Silence here as members of Parliament, members of the House of Lords and their guests await the arrival of His Majesty. Waiting to greet him, the new Lord Great Chamberlain, Lord Rupert Carrington, 7th Baron Carrington, became Lord Great Chamberlain on the day of the Queen's death, taking over from the 7th Marquess of Cholmondeley. The King and the Queen Consort step out of the car. As they make their way into Westminster Hall, the state trumpeters play a fanfare. party approaches the two thrones, and on either side, the Lord Speaker and the Speaker of the House of Commons. The parliamentary maces covered for this ceremony. The maces, a symbol of royal authority, superseded when the King himself is present here at Westminster. So we'll hear first the Lord Speaker, Lord McFall of Alcuith, who will present his address to the new King.
Your Majesty, I welcome you and Her Majesty the Queen Consort to Parliament today on this solemn occasion. Her late Majesty, our treasured Queen, and your beloved and deeply missed mother came here to Westminster Hall many times to receive the congratulations of her loyal subjects in the two Houses of Parliament and to celebrate with them historic landmarks and her long life of dedicated public service. She was both a leader to and a servant of her people. Her humility and integrity commanded the respect and captured the imagination of peoples and nations across the globe. Her late Majesty's joyous, unstinting and reassuring presence across the years made it difficult to contemplate that her long and inspiring reign of deep and unparalleled devotion would ever end. We and the nation closed our eyes to this inevitability, but it has ended. Only a few months after we celebrated Her late Majesty's historic Platinum Jubilee. And as you said so movingly, Your Majesty, in your address to the nation, we all now feel a sense of loss beyond measure. Nevertheless, the qualities that Her late Majesty embodied with such constancy remain to inspire you, Your Majesty, your family, and all your subjects. We remember her commitment, her kindness, her humour, her courage, and her fortitude, as well as the deep faith which was the anchor in her life. Your Majesty, this is a historic space. Its walls built more than 900 years ago by William Rufus, and the magnificent hammer beam roof above us, commissioned 300 years later by Richard II. Since medieval times, much of our national story has taken place within these very walls, from civic gatherings to coronation banquets to the centuries during which this hall was at the heart of our legal system. But this ancient hall is a living space, and like our great nation, it continues to evolve. In 2012, Her late Majesty came to Westminster Hall to mark her Diamond Jubilee, and we saw the unveiling of the splendid memorial window, commissioned by both members of Parliament's houses, which now graces the north wall of this historic space. And now, for 10 years, the light from that window has added beauty to the grey stones of this place, bathing them in colour and reminding hundreds, nay, thousands, millions of visitors to the Palace of Westminster of Her late Majesty's dedicated life of service. Like the light that shines through this memorial window, Her late Majesty's magnificent achievements will live on by permanently illuminating and enriching our lives and our national discourse. Your Majesty, even as we mourn the loss of our dear Queen, we and future generations will draw strength from her shining example. Your Majesty, on behalf of all the members of the House of Lords, I pledge my loyalty to you and wish you and Her Majesty, the Queen Consort, well in the life of service to which you have dedicated yourself. We are proud and indeed humbled to welcome you as our King, and we look forward to welcoming you on many more occasions to Parliament and to this hall in the years ahead. Finally, Your Majesty, the House has commissioned me to deliver the following humble address, which their Lordships agreed on the 10th of September. I shall now read the address. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Lords spiritual and temporal in Parliament assembled, beg to leave to convey to Your Majesty the deep sympathy felt by this House in the grief Your Majesty has sustained by the death of our late beloved Queen, Your Majesty's mother of blessed and glorious memory. To extend to all the royal family the deep sympathy of this House in their grief, which is shared by all members. To assure Your Majesty that the example of selfless public service, which our late Sovereign displayed over her reign of 70 years, her untiring endeavours for the welfare of her peoples, and her fortitude in adversity will ever be held in reverent, affectionate and grateful remembrance. And to express to Your Majesty our loyalty to Your Majesty's royal person and our firm conviction that under the blessing of divine providence, Your Majesty will, throughout your reign, further the happiness and protect the liberties of all your peoples in all your realms.
So a very personal address, and then the formal address of condolence from the Lord Speaker, Lord McFall of Alcuith. Speech then presented to the King. And now, the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle.
Your Majesty, let me repeat a welcome to you and to Her Majesty, the Queen Consort. On this solemn occasion, members of both Houses of Parliament gather here to express our deep sympathy for the loss we have all sustained in the death of our Sovereign Lady, Queen Elizabeth. We have seen that this is a loss that is felt around the world. It is a loss to the United Kingdom, the overseas territories, the Crown dependencies, and many countries over which she reigned. It is a loss to the entire Commonwealth, which she did so much to nurture. It is a loss to all of us, but we know, most of all, it is a loss to you, Your Majesty, and to the royal family. Newspapers have been filled with photographs of Her late Majesty since the news broke. The most touching have been the glimpses into the family life which we usually kept sheltered from public view. Deep as our grief is, we know yours is deeper. We offer our heartfelt sympathy to you and all the royal family. We know that there is nothing we can say in the praise of our late Queen, your mother, that you will not already know. Over the past days, members of the House have spoken of their encounters with Queen Elizabeth. They have spoken of her sense of duty, her wisdom, her kindness, her humour, how she touched the lives of hundreds of thousands of their constituents in her visits to every part of this country. The words have been heartfelt. She sat in this historic hall, as you sit now on many occasions. Some of those occasions were to celebrate milestones in her own reign. The addresses to celebrate her silver, golden and diamond jubilees shared a common thread, that our constitutional monarchy is a symbol of stability in an ever-changing world. As Speaker Boothroyd said, Queen Elizabeth's wisdom and grace demonstrated for all to see the value of a constitutional monarchy in securing the liberties of our citizens and the fundamental unity of this kingdom and the Commonwealth. On other occasions, our late Queen was here to mark the historic moments, such as the 50th anniversary of the Second World War, a war in which she herself served in the armed forces. And in 1988, we celebrated the 300th anniversary of the revolutions of 1688 to 1689. It is perhaps very British to celebrate revolutions by presenting an address to Her Majesty. But those revolutions led to our constitutional freedoms, set out the foundation for a stable monarchy which protects liberty. In your first address to the nation, you recognised your life would change as a result of the new responsibilities. You pledge yourself to uphold constitutional principles at the heart of our nation. These are weighty responsibilities, as the early Queen Elizabeth said in her final speech to parliamentarians. To be a king and wear a crown is a thing more glorious to them that see it, that it is pleasant, that them that bear it. We know you hold the greatest respect, the precious traditions, the freedoms and responsibilities of our unique history and our system of parliamentary governance. We know that you will bear those responsibilities which fall to you with the fortitude, dignity demonstrated by Her late Majesty. When the House met at the Accession Council, my first symbolic act was to make the oath to be faithful and bear true allegiance to Your Majesty, King Charles. And so it is my duty to present our humble address to you, our new King, to express both our sorrow and loss of our Sovereign Lady and our confidence in the future in your reign. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's dutiful, loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in Parliament assembled, express deep sympathy felt by this House for the great sorrow which Your Majesty has sustained by the death of the late Queen, Your Majesty's mother. Extended to all the royal family the deep sympathy of this House in their grief, which is shared by all its members. Assure Your Majesty that Her late Majesty's unstinting dedication over a reign of over 70 years to the service of our great country and its people, and to the service of the countries and the peoples of the rest of the wider Commonwealth, which will always be held affectionate and grateful remembrance. And to express to Your Majesty our loyalty to you and our conviction that you will strive to uphold the liberties and to promote the happiness of the people in all your realms, now and in years to come.
The address on behalf of members of the House of Commons, delivered by the Speaker of the House of Commons, Lindsay Hoyle, presented now to the King. A rare chance to see the Speaker in full ceremonial robes, as opposed to the rather simpler garb he wears when on daily duty in the House of Commons. Now the response from the King.
My Lords and members of the House of Commons, I am deeply grateful for the addresses of condolence by the House of Lords and the House of Commons, which so touchingly encompass what our late sovereign, my beloved mother, the Queen, meant to us all. As Shakespeare says of the earlier Queen Elizabeth, she was a pattern to all princes living. As I stand before you today, I cannot help but feel the weight of history which surrounds us and which reminds us of the vital parliamentary traditions to which members of both houses dedicate yourselves with such personal commitment for the betterment of us all. Parliament is the living and breathing instrument of our democracy. That your traditions are ancient, we see in the construction of this great hall, and the reminders of medieval predecessors of the office to which I have been called, and the tangible connections to my darling late mother we see all around us, from the fountain in New Palace Yard, which commemorates the late Queen's Silver Jubilee, to the sundial in Old Palace Yard for the Golden Jubilee, the magnificent stained glass window before me for the Diamond Jubilee, and so poignantly and yet to be formally unveiled, your most generous gift to Her late Majesty to mark the unprecedented Platinum Jubilee, which we celebrated only 3 months ago, with such joyful hearts. The great bell of Big Ben, one of the most powerful symbols of our nation throughout the world, and housed within the Elizabeth Tower, also named for my mother's Diamond Jubilee, will mark the passage of the late Queen's progress from Buckingham Palace to this Parliament on Wednesday. My Lords and members of the House of Commons, we gather today in remembrance of the remarkable span of the Queen's dedicated service to her nations and peoples. While very young, Her late Majesty pledged herself to serve her country and her people, and to maintain the precious principles of constitutional government which lie at the heart of our nation. This vow she kept with unsurpassed devotion. She set an example of selfless duty, which, with God's help and your counsels, I am resolved faithfully to follow.
The address by His Majesty the King, presented now to Speaker of the Lords and to the Speaker of the Commons, before the national anthem, played by the band of the Household Cavalry.
King's Bodyguard, King's Bodyguard, shut up!
of the Household Cavalry, directed by Major Paul Collis Smith. And for many people, most people in this Westminster Great Hall, a first time to sing the national anthem to the words, "God save our gracious King." The Lord Great Chamberlain leads His Majesty and Her Majesty the Queen Consort towards the north door. This the start of a busy day. They depart from here to RAF Northolt, the RAF base, the oldest RAF base. In fact, it predates the creation of the RAF by 3 years. From there they will fly to Edinburgh for a day of engagements that include an audience with Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, and a service of prayer at St Giles Cathedral. The relationship between the monarch and Parliament, shown by the familiar faces here today, former Prime Ministers. And to the left of the King, the leaders of all the Westminster parties, Conservative, Labour, Democrat, Scottish Nationalist and Democratic Unionist Party. That speech from the King, reflecting on the many symbols of his mother in the Palace of Westminster. Here in this hall, that glorious window, 1,500 pieces, constructed for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 2012. This hall, dating back to the end of the 11th century, when it was built, the largest room in England, perhaps all of Europe. More than 900 years it has stood at the heart of the Palace of Westminster, witness to the evolution of our political system. Words that we've heard this morning, well, the language at times may have felt a little old-fashioned, but in the addresses we heard delivered by the two speakers, a clear message, the expectation that the new monarch will act to protect the rights and freedoms of his subjects. It's Prince Charles, now the King, King Charles III, shakes the hands of the speakers. It feels as if just briefly the maelstrom of daily political life, hardline positions taken by parties on one side or the other, has briefly been put aside here at Westminster this morning, as members of both houses start to consider the relationship Parliament will forge with the new King. King and the Queen Consort into the car that will take them to RAF Northolt. From thence their journey will continue by air to Edinburgh. And that busy day of events in the Scottish capital.
Well, they have departed Westminster, His Majesty the King and the Queen Consort, after a ceremony that really marks the beginning of the relationship that he will have as sovereign with this Parliament and with the parliaments that will follow. He heard expressions of loyalty and also expressions of sympathy. And he spoke himself of the sense of history that surrounded him in this very special place, the very oldest part of the Palace of Westminster. Giles Brandreth is still with me, and we're also joined in the studio by Valerie Amos, Baroness Amos, a Labour peer, and very recently appointed by the late Queen to the Order of the Garter. It was your fellow parliamentarians, Baroness Amos, who were there for this moment, and a very special moment, particularly them standing and singing God Save the King in his presence.
It is really special, isn't it? Because these are moments which are both about continuity and they're about change. It's a solemn occasion, but it is also one which has a degree of pageantry which we do so well. And what I was really struck by in the House of Lords when I sat in on the tributes were the tributes which talked about the late Queen in terms of the contributions that she had made, very similar words used by everyone, but also the personal reflections and some of the personal stories, bringing in that humour as well, which really helped us to think about her as somebody who was so warm, so special, and really had a way of engaging with people. But it was also a moment when people were talking about our new king and were making it absolutely clear that we would be loyal to that new king, and expressing sympathy for the royal family, because this is both a public mourning but also a very personal one.
Yes, and indeed in the King's own words, he was really feeling that sense of history that surrounded him. He talked about the medieval hall and indeed about all those who had gone before him back to the Saxons.
This extraordinary ceremony was an expression of how constitutional monarchy now works. The new king, as modern as tomorrow, but with a lot of time for yesterday. There was 900 years of history. There was Shakespeare being quoted. This is the second time we've heard Shakespeare. I think probably he's going to make the hallmark of his reign, quoting Shakespeare in every speech.
There's plenty to quote.
He loves his Shakespeare. But what I thought was so wonderful about this, the two speeches were, to my mind, impeccable. And this was the House of Lords, the House of Commons coming together. People who don't know the Palace of Westminster may not realise that, in fact, as individuals, parliamentarians of all parties actually get on rather well, and there are many cross-party friendships. John McFall there, Lindsay Hoyle, one a former Labour MP, the other a Labour MP, and in fact the son of a Labour MP, Doug Hoyle. These are good people, and they spoke so well, so movingly, both about the traditions, aware of that, the importance of the constitutional monarchy, the boundaries that there are, the value of the Commonwealth. Everything was in there, and it was clear that the King recognises all that.
Baroness Amos, I was thinking that when you were appointed to the Order of the Garter, it was just a few days after the Platinum Jubilee, wasn't it? Indeed, it turned out to be the last set of appointments to the Garter that Her late Majesty made.
That's right, and the appointments were made slightly out of order because usually it is on St George's Day. They were actually announced as part of the New Year's honours. Garter Day is in June, and I was very privileged to have an opportunity to have a private audience with the late Queen on the Friday before Garter Day, when she actually presented to me, went through with me the insignia of the order, and then we had a conversation which had some very serious elements to it, but also some very light-hearted elements as well.
Would you share any of what was said? What was the atmosphere of that? I mean, it was a very special moment for you.
It was a very special moment because I had been Lord President of the Council, of the Privy Council, so I had overseen Privy Council meetings for over 4 years, when I had had an opportunity to have a brief conversation with the late Queen in advance of Privy Council meetings 9 times a year. And the really humorous part was the delight she showed when she talked to me about the filming of the Paddington sketch, which we all have seen now, and what it was like doing that, and talking about the sort of stickiness of the marmalade sandwich and having to put it in and out of the handbag, and that jars of marmalade had already started arriving from members of the public to Windsor Castle.
Indeed, the people at the Royal Parks have said, please, no more marmalade sandwiches and Paddington Bears laying your tributes outside Buckingham Palace. We've had too many of them.
Yes.
But to be a member of the Order of the Garter is an extraordinary thing. It is the highest honour outside of having the Victoria Cross or the George Cross. It outranks everything. And the Queen took it very seriously. She valued its heritage and tradition. And I'm sure she showed you the ribbons and the motto, "On y soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who evil thinks of it. Her whole attitude to everything was positive. She looked for the best in people.
And indeed, the ceremony we've just seen has been about her as well as about the new king, and that it is that combination which is in everyone's minds at the moment. But it sounds as if in that time she spent with you, this was shortly after the Jubilee celebrations,
yes,
and the Paddington Bear speech. It sounds as if she had relished the reaction to it.
She really did relish it, and she was also extremely pleased that the fact that she had participated in that sketch had not leaked. Because she said so many people had worked on it, and they had filmed it, I think, about 3 months before it was shown. She was very pleased about that. Yeah.
She had a great sense of humour. One of the things that people don't realise, there's a fraught relationship over history between Parliament and the sovereign, inevitably. I mean, Westminster Hall is where King Charles I was tried and then beheaded. So there's tension there. There's the statue of Oliver Cromwell outside. But the Queen was aware of the tension, but also, for example, the state opening of Parliament. When the Queen arrived at Parliament, there had to be a parliamentarian taken hostage at Buckingham Palace.
Even now?
Even
now.
Yes. I assume the tradition will continue with the new king.
But usually they're having a cup of tea, Giles.
They are indeed.
they're not tied up.
I was in the Whip's office in the 1990s, and the then Vice Chamberlain, the Member of Parliament who was sent, looked forward to it because he got a tea served by the pages and biscuits as well, and he was kept prisoner at Buckingham Palace until the Queen was safely returned. His role, too, the Vice-Chamberlain, was to write a daily report on what was happening in the House of Commons to the Queen. In addition to Hansard, which shows the official record, he would send a daily letter to Her Majesty recording not just the events, but who had spoken, how well they'd spoken, who was on the up, who told a particularly good joke. And the Queen enjoyed the joke that he was called, this man, Sidney Chapman. So she said, for reasons of political correctness, perhaps we should now call him Sidney Person.
Well, no wonder her prime ministers have always said how well briefed she is if she was getting a daily letter from Parliament. But Baroness Amos, this was a moment, really, this particular ceremony, where we really did see an illustration of our parliamentary democracy. Parliament is sovereign, of course. But the Queen herself, when she came to Parliament for her Diamond Jubilee, talked about that process of actively signing bills into law.
Yes, we have to remember that our constitutional arrangements mean that our sovereign, Parliament and government all have a role to play. And the roles are different but equal. I also thought what was so significant about this ceremony is that we are beginning to see reflected in some of these ancient roles the changes that we have seen in Britain throughout the Queen's reign. We have a black sergeant at arms. We have a woman who is Black Rod. That would not have happened when the late Queen became the Queen.
These are all signs of the times.
These are all signs of change.
Thank you very much for the moment. This is another moment in that ceremony in Westminster Hall where we heard tributes being paid to the late Queen. And in recent days, of course, there have been so many of them from right across the country and indeed from far beyond. So here's a little of what we've heard from overseas.
This is a time of deep sadness. Young or old, there is no doubt that a chapter is closing today. And with that, we share our thanks for an incredible woman who we were lucky enough to call our Queen.
We will remember and perpetuate the values she never ceased to embody and promote. The moral fortitude of democracy and freedom.
She was an incredibly gracious and decent woman. And the thoughts and prayers of the American people are with the people of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth in their grief.
This time of mourning will pass, but the deep respect and warm regard in which Australians have always held for Her Majesty will never fade.
We thank you, Your Majesty, for your services to our country as our Queen and Head of State. Farewell, our beloved Mrs. Queen.
She has given to all of us in all these years always stability, confidence. She has shown an immense amount of courage, and therefore my prayers are with her.
важка втрата для усієї Європи і для світу. Від імені усього українського народу висловлюю співчуття королівській родині, усій Великій Британії та країнам співдружності націй.
Canada is in mourning. She was one of my favorite people in the world.
Just some of the tributes paid to Her late Majesty, and in his remarks at Westminster Hall, the King spoke of resolving faithfully to follow her example of selfless duty. Giles, they are very large shoes to step into.
Extraordinary, the global reach of the Queen. Ours is only the 21st most populated country in the world, the 6th largest economy. But our head of state is, by all the surveys accounts, the most famous head of state on the planet. So to follow the footsteps of this Queen, loved universally, is a challenge. But I think he's equal to it. He has travelled widely himself. He knows the Commonwealth, he loves the Commonwealth, and the Queen Consort has been preparing for this for some time and has already taken on some of the former Queen's involvements in various Commonwealth organisations.
But I would also add that there is a deep understanding, isn't there, Giles, from the work that he did as Prince of Wales, through the Prince's Trust and elsewhere, of a whole host of issues which are facing us both as Britain and globally. Those issues around the environment, climate change, inequality.
And young people.
And young people.
He may be 73, but actually, through the Prince's Trust, he really has his finger on the pulse of the problems of literally teenagers, people in their 20s, people with disadvantage.
Looking forward, you know, I feel very strongly that what this transition feels as if it's about, it is both about the past, it's about the present, but it's also about having a king who really understands some of those challenges, those future challenges that we're going to have to face.
And Giles, he is also striking in all his public statements so far a tone of history and a human tone as well, a personal tone.
That's what this morning has been about. That is what this whole experience is. It is human. This is a family. This is anyone who has lost a parent will know what he is feeling. But also, he is part of our history. This is part of our heritage, and he is looking to tomorrow and the future, being aware of the past. And we must be aware too that this is a man who's lost his mum. This only a few days ago.
4 days ago, in fact. Thank you both for being with us through this ceremony, Giles Brandreth and also Baroness Amos. And that brings to an end events in London this morning after a ceremony in the heart of the Palace of Westminster, the first visit by His Majesty Charles III there as King. He and the Queen Consort are now travelling to Edinburgh for a service of prayer and reflection. And you'll be able to see live coverage of that on BBC One and of events at the Palace of Holyrood House and the Scottish Parliament. All of that from 1 o'clock this afternoon. For now, from us, goodbye.